briefly through the remaining models. And then, as I say, have a little bit of time for a couple more exemplars as well as questions. Next model is the TPACK model. And the TPACK model was designed to address the following situation. About 30 years ago, the standard way of designing instruction using technology was to do it the following way. To say, well, okay, I have a unit of content. I'm going to focus the design of my unit of instruction around that content I want to teach. So I focus there. And then once I've done most of the design of that portion of the course, I bring along the pedagogy. And I say, okay, I'm now going to, if this were a sandwich, well, I've already got the sandwich. The pedagogy is kind of like the condiment I bring in, a little bit of mayonnaise to put on the sandwich, but I've already done most of the design. And then after that, after I've done all of that, with most of the design being ready, I say, okay, so what technology should I bring along that kind of lets me do this? And the technology is kind of like the toothpick in the sandwich. That turns out not to make very tasty sandwiches. The reason it doesn't work very well is that when you design like that, when you start everything based upon the content, then bring along the pedagogy after most of that work is done, then bring in the technology after most of that work is done, well, each successive stage winds up being more of a question of saying, how do I force things into what I've already got, rather than seeing how everything works together to give you the best outcomes. And in particular, that works rather poorly in terms of going to the upper levels of the SAMR model, to the redefinition type levels. So people say, okay, well, this is how you do it. What you really want to do is design your unit of instruction, bringing together both content and pedagogy. So you work with those at the same time to design most of the unit of instruction, and then you bring in the technology afterwards to see how you implement that. That works better than the first model. It does indeed give you better results, but it still doesn't give you the best possible results. Again, what happens usually is you've got most of the things, and the technology winds up being either accidental or mostly doing substitution to augmentation type work. It still doesn't push things as far as they could. So what happened then is Mishra and Kohler came along and said, well, let's look at all this work, and let's really focus on how those people that have gotten the best outcomes design their courses, design their instruction. And what Mishra and Kohler found is that to get the best outcomes, to get the best results, you need to be thinking about technology, pedagogy, and content at the same time as you're designing a unit of instruction, and as peers of equal importance to each other. Hence the name of the model, TPCK, Technological, Pedagogical, Content, Knowledge, TPACK. And this is what gives you the best results. In other words, when you look at the course design, the instructional design that gives you the best outcomes, you find that it's when people have done this, thought about all three of these aspects at the same time. Now, I want to make one quick side comment here before we go any further. Some people ask me, well, what about, say, design from the technology side first? Yeah, that really doesn't work. It's what I call the, ooh, shiny approach to course design. I saw a nice piece of technology. It's so pretty. I must put it in my course. Well, yeah, that tends to lead to courses that you wonder, okay, the technology is great, but what does everything else have to do with the technology? So it's great to look at the technology, see how it's being used elsewhere, and find inspiration in that. It's great to say, I really would like to bring this in, but don't let yourself be led by that so far that your entire course design becomes driven just or primarily by a technology. So as I say, Mishra and Kohler say, no, you want to be thinking about all three of these at the same time. Now, the important thing to realize is we all know that this is a very difficult thing to do indeed. Usually you'd say, well, geez, I have to keep the content, the pedagogy, and the technology in exactly at the same time. Well, no. You can get away with a staged approach, so long as you're careful. In other words, you can say, I've got a rough idea of the content I want to teach, and some idea of the key things I want to hear about this. Great. But before I go much further, let me think about the pedagogical approach that will best complement or will best implement my ideas about that content. Wonderful. But before I solidify the design much further, let me think about which technologies would best allow me to do this and how maybe I might be able to push a little further using the technology. That suggests I might need to change some ideas about the pedagogical approach. I'll go back and change that. And that in turn suggests, well, maybe I want to shift the focus of the content a bit to deal with this and add this activity. You see how it's working. In other words, instead of doing most of one, then most of the other, and then most of the other, or doing two of them and then the other, you're saying you're doing a little bit, you're roughing out the content, and then adding the pedagogy, roughing in its addition, then adding roughly the technology, and then going through a set of cycles of refinement. And let me tell you something. Here I started with content, then went to pedagogy, then technology, and then found my way back around the loop. I've done some research on some practices that work particularly well here, but I'll tell you what the research showed me for the most part, the most important result. Everybody does this a little differently, and so long as you work with it well and it works for you, that's fine. So if it works best for you to start like that and then work backwards the way I mentioned, great. If it works best for you to do kind of a spiral around, also great. And there's other ways of progressing through this. Again, the key thing is think about all of these three together. Don't let yourself go too far in the direction of design with one without thinking of the other two into the picture. That gives you the best results, that gives you the best design, and frankly also tends to give you the designs that are easiest to implement overall. Because you're not suddenly saying, oh, if I'd spent more time on this portion, it would be so much easier to do it now. It's what gives you the best feel, if you will, for how things are going to fit together. Now, there's another aspect of the TPACK model which I'm not going to, unfortunately, be able to spend time on today, which is the fact that when you put it out like a Venn diagram like this, it defines 7 subsets, 7 areas, each of which corresponds to a subdomain of the intersection between technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge that you can use to design your course. And in particular, there's a way you can use these 7 areas as sort of a checklist for things that you should know, things you should keep in mind as you're designing, resources that you might want to have in hand as you're designing. So for instance, PCK refers to that portion of pedagogy for teaching a specific content area. If you're teaching, say, algebra, it might be the research we have on how people perceive visually and how that relates to how they understand graphs. TPK refers to how a particular technology can be used to implement a particular pedagogical approach. TCK refers to how a particular technology is transforming a content knowledge area. And TPCK is, of course, where everything comes together, where you're looking at what other people have done to integrate specific pedagogies, technologies, and content knowledge areas. Again, there's much, much more that you can do with that. You can use that as a way to make sure that you have everything you need as you're designing, etc. I won't have time to deal with that today, but I have to tell you that all the slides you're seeing, and in fact an extra set, will be available to you from my website, and I'll put that on the last slide so you know where to go to download them. And so you'll have access to all these slides, and all the slides are linked to resources. And one of the resources that I link from these slides is a set of podcasts that I've done that go into exhaustive detail on how to use TPACK for that detailed checklist purpose I just mentioned, with many examples and so on. So you'll have additional materials if you're interested in using that for your purposes. The third model. This is a model I'm calling the first 200,000 years of educational technologies. And it's based upon research that I just completed recently, as I mentioned before, which is based upon the following. I was looking at all the spectrum of technologies and saying, well, geez, we have so many technologies. Are there ways of classifying them to see which subgroupings of technology are particularly effective in education? And in particular, I've been working with a project called the Horizon Report over the past decade, so we have 10 years worth of data, where what we do is we identify each year 2 technologies that are particularly promising or particularly, have already shown particularly good results for use in the short term in education, two technologies for the medium term and two technologies for the long term. We've been doing this over 10 years. We have a data bank of 10 years worth of data. And what I found was when I went back to this data bank, I could classify all the technologies that showed up there in one of 5 categories. And what I found very pleasing was that those 5 categories corresponded to key moments in the evolution of humanity, in other words, in the process of how we became human. So that felt very nice. That felt very elegant. It also allowed me to do one more thing, which is to say, since I know some things from research into each of these key steps, key developments, that also will help me understand better how to use these technologies in my teaching. So I won't go through the 5. Christina, of course, has been showing you some examples already in these categories. I just want to speak just a little bit more to each one of them. I won't have too much time to say much more in detail about each of these stages. Again, there's a video on YouTube if you're interested in watching it, where I spend about 20 minutes going through each of these stages. But I just want to speak to each one briefly right now. The first one is social. And social is very important. We've already talked about. These are all the technologies, whether it be blogs or YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or wikis, etc., that allow us to work together, share together, talk with each other, etc., in new ways, in different ways, over networks. And again, these are very powerful technologies in terms of their yield in education. They can do immensely interesting and new things. But there's one interesting little detail I want to point out from the research into this particular area. Many people have surmised that the key change that occurred around 200,000 years ago had to do with language. Fine. And in particular, some people have theorized, and I tend to agree with them, the particular person I have in mind, for instance, is Ruben Puentedura, that one of the key elements that we got particularly good at, that triggered a huge amount of development, was we got really good at, yes, talking with each other. In particular, we got really good at gossiping. Very important. Gossip is a really important way to transmit information about all sorts of things. And that's something I'd like you to keep in mind, because sometimes we tend to get too pure in our use of social technologies. We tend to say, this system, this social system, this learning management system, this blog is for education only. We will only talk about very serious things here. No, we will not talk about play. We will not post the silly pictures from the party here. We will not gossip. Definitely not. And unfortunately, if you do that, you sometimes block or thwart the development of some of these. So I want to encourage you to think about how you can incorporate more of these less serious aspects, whether it's by allowing some of it on the school systems or by using systems like Facebook that, of course, have as their primary mission that play social gossip aspect, because there's a certain liveliness there that is something that we can leverage. Next one is mobility. Again, I've already talked about mobile technologies, but there's important aspects to keep in mind about mobility. Mobility, we are, of all animals, we move around a lot. We are really good at moving around the place. And one of the things we do in terms of being able to move around the place is to develop tools, technologies, etc., to help us move around the place. This is one of them. This is a spear point that is designed so it can catch all sorts of pony fish. Why? Because when you're moving around the place, you don't know what the next fish is going to look like. Or other technologies like needles. Why are needles a mobility technology? Because you need good needles to make good shoes. Okay, and shoes are clearly a mobility technology. So, think about it this way. You have the obvious aspects of mobility technologies, like the fact that a tablet or laptop can be with a child anywhere they go. But also think about the supporting technologies that support mobility. Things like a USB drive that can be quickly tossed, that doesn't take up any room, so it can go with you. Or having data in the cloud, so that you can access it from anywhere, anytime. Next one is visualization. And I'm defining visualization here as the capacity to take something from the domain of the abstract and make it tangible, either as an image in 2D or as a 3D object, as this is. This is a visualization of an idea of beauty in the form of a 3D statuette. It's quite wonderful. It's the Venus of Hohenfels. And that's what it is. It's a visualization of an abstract concept of beauty in a concrete form. And any time you can take an abstract concept, no matter what the domain is, math, science, but it can also be history, geography, it can be literature, it doesn't matter where the abstraction comes from. If you can take that abstraction and make it tangible via a concrete visual 2D, or yes, in some cases, 3D representation, if you can use a technology to do that, again, those technologies have huge educational payoff values. A little bit closer in time to us, only, wow, 17,000 years ago, recent, just yesterday. We have storytelling, but I'm not talking about storytelling in general, I'm talking about a particular form of storytelling. It's the form of storytelling that becomes tangible in objects. I have here the caves at Lascaux. The important thing about the caves at Lascaux is not that they have paintings on the walls, but that those paintings tell a coherent story. It's a story of a hunt. The people who painted Lascaux had objects in there, elements, things like visual details that tell you how the hunt progresses. And what's more, the space of the cave is involved in the story, so that when you get to the end of the story, and I hate to tell you it's a sad ending, you know, it's right there, leader gets gored by an auroch and dies. The progression through the cave itself also becomes more difficult. You only get to the end of the story in the tough, most involved aspect, so that your difficulty in traversing the cave has become a part of the story. Well, this type of storytelling that becomes embodied in objects has its digital counterpart in what's called digital storytelling. And once again, anytime you have a technology that allows students to take knowledge that either they or somebody else has created and to structure it into a digital narrative with different objects, whether they be image, sound, video, interactive interfaces, etc., in this form of a digital story, you're leveraging what we have as human beings known how to do for many, many thousands of years now, at least 17,000, which is to take all of this and translate it into something that makes sense to us. So you have a huge payoff from that. And finally, really, not even yesterday, almost last night, 8,000 years ago or so, we have gaming. Now, of course, there may be older games, but with the artifacts don't survive. The earliest game artifacts that survive are what you see there, which are an early form of dice. They're called tabas. Cow vertebrae that are tossed, obviously. The other one from about the same period of time that survives to this day is Mancala, as a game for which we do have artifacts that are that old. And with gaming, lots of ways of thinking about gaming, but I'm going to encourage you to think about gaming in one particular form, one particular fashion, which is to say, think of gaming as something that can drive a story so that the person who is playing the game takes a personal stake in shaping the outcome of that story. In other words, when I'm playing a game and I want to win, I want to beat the game, well, I can view that as saying, I have a story, but now I'm more engrossed in it, I'm more driven by it, because I want to shape how it ends. I want to have it end a certain way with the outcome. So let me give you an example, for instance, which doesn't just take, so we say, storytelling in that sense, but which also involves visualization. If I have a scenario where I have a student that's in a course where urbanization is an important component of the course, well, there are excellent simulations of the different components that make up a city, and seeing how they interact, and seeing how sometimes you get these unusually remarkable, unexpected side effects from their interaction. You know, that work was done at the MIT Systems Group. But if you try to just look at the numbers by themselves, they're very hard to make sense of. So you can use a visualization that gives you good charts, good representations to make better sense of that data. So you can take Jay Forrester's team's models and say, oh, I see how, for instance, public transport influences certain aspects of a city. This is how, you know, getting certain types of zoning has certain outcomes. That's interesting. But if you really, really want to get students involved in this, get them to view it as a story of the life of a city that they are going to write the end to. Get them to a point where say, I don't just want this to be any old city. I'm just kind of sitting here and looking at how interesting it is. I want to understand it because I want to make a city that looks just like fill in the blank of your favorite or least favorite city in the world, right? And I want to beat the game. I want to make the biggest city, the wealthiest city, the healthiest city, the most green city, whatever it is that you've set as the end goal of the game. You can get your student to be involved in it because they want to drive it. And to get to that goal, they really need to understand how these systems interact. Well, by the way, that exists. That game is called SimCity. All SimCity is a layer of game put on top of Jay Forrester's, and yes, it is Jay Forrester's models that are underneath SimCity. So that's an example. It's an example that's been tried and works very successfully. That gives you an idea of why you want to use games as another place to look for good technologies. So bottom line, if you have a technology that you want to use that doesn't fit in one of these 5 categories, that's fine. I'm not saying don't use it. So it's not intended to be an interdiction on technologies that don't fall into one of these 5 categories. It's intended to be used in the other direction, saying, I've got a project, I'm looking for interesting or potentially powerful technologies to use in the context of my project. Where should I be looking at? These 5 categories can give you some ideas, some clues, some suggestions for what to look for and why. All right. So those are the models. But I mentioned that you've got the models, but you need to focus them through some sort of a lens in terms of getting a bigger picture for what you're going to accomplish, what's going to come out at the end of the road. And that lens is 21st century learning. Now, of course, in Sweden, you've got a set of standards for 21st century learning, and that's great. We've got, in the States, depending on where you go, you have several different standards that have been developed by different organizations, the Partnership for 21st Century Learning, other groups. If you go to the European Community, it's got its own set of standards. There was a set commissioned by the World Bank, etc. All sorts of different groups have come up with 21st century standards. So one of the questions you might ask is, great, which one do I use? And you could say, well, I'll just use the one from Sweden, and that's great if you want to. But one thing that can help is if you say, take a step back. Look at all these standards and see what they have in common. Now, you could do that for yourself. Trouble is, there's about 24 of these standards. Well, fortunately, you don't have to do it. Punya Mishra, yes, same guy as in TPAC, and Karelvik, last year did just this. Took all 24 or so of these standards and analyzed them and boiled them down to the key core elements that all of them have in common. And that's great, because this, again, gives you the kind of general type of tool, like the models that we've looked at so far, that is really useful for design. Sometimes when you look at the standards or for something like 21st century learning with some of the all the fine details in place, etc., it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. This helps you sidestep that problem. And there are 3 major categories: foundational knowledge, meta-knowledge, and humanistic knowledge, that Mishra and Karelvik identified, and then 3 subcategories within each of them. Now, I'm not going to enumerate all the points. You can read the paper. I strongly would recommend it. You can look at the individual ones, and some of them are self-explanatory anyway. But I want to highlight some of the particularly important ones that I see here. For instance, cross-disciplinary knowledge and synthesis. That's particularly important because it implies 2 things. One, the disciplines aren't going away. Some people will tell you, well, we no longer need the disciplines. That's just not true. Disciplines still play a valuable and important role in helping us structure, understand, manage the domain of human knowledge. But just by the same token, even though the disciplines, subject areas survive, it also becomes just as important to know how to bridge them, how to work among them, how to create things that use the respective knowledge gained in one, but create a new synthesis from them. Very important to keep that in mind as you're going through the development of standards. Information literacy, also very important. Any human being alive today here has access to more information than anybody else ever had in the whole of the history of the human race. Anybody in, say, one of the privileged libraries of the Renaissance, any one of them would be overwhelmed with what you can find, with what you have access by just logging in and looking, say, at Google Books in 5 minutes. It exceeds hugely anything previously encountered. But by the same token, it's a torrent of information, and we have to work with our students to help them understand how to use it, how to decide what's good, what's not good, what's useful, what's not useful, slice it up in different ways, access portions of it, and contribute ethically to it. So information literacy becomes not something that you do in a separate course, but something that's a characteristic of how you work with all of this throughout. For meta-knowledge, I want to highlight in particular 2 aspects. Here, critical thinking. Critical thinking is something that should run through all courses, not something, again, that's only isolated to certain courses or even a course unto itself. A course unto itself doesn't work real well. You want to think about how that gets built in throughout. And also in communication and collaboration, something I've already pointed out in the example I talked about, which is the fact that we're looking at forms of collaboration and communication that are very different from what we've had in the past. When I work, for instance, on Wikipedia, on a wiki, I don't know who I'm editing with. I just found out recently who is another editor of an article I contribute to regularly, just by virtue of an accident of chatting at a conference. But for the most part, we don't have a formal team. We don't say, okay, you'll do this, I'll do that, right? And yet somehow we produce something that's useful, flawed, with problems everywhere. I certainly am happy to admit all of that, and yet very useful and unique and powerful. That's a form of collaboration we haven't seen before. We want to get our students into that form of collaboration. I already mentioned another one. When students are sharing their annotations from that ebook reader, that's a form of collaboration too, and one we haven't seen before. So again, think about how you can sponsor this. And last, but far from least, something I mentioned before, the 2 items of cultural competence and ethical and emotional awareness. No student alive today is going to be working in an environment where the only people they'll meet are those in their community. They'll be meeting and interacting with people from all over the world. And again, we need to build up their capacity to work with those people, to understand those people who come from incredibly different backgrounds on their own terms, with both ethical respect and an emotional awareness for the processes involved. So again, these are lenses that help us focus, decide what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And one more thing. People ask me about the standards, and you've just completed a new set of standards here in Sweden. We're currently actually going through the same process right now in the States. It's what's called in the States the Common Core standards. They're very interesting, lots of interesting things happen in that context. We haven't completed them, some good things, some more problematic things. Doesn't matter, it's a standards process. Some interesting things are coming out of it, but people ask me, so should we use SAMR and those other models you mentioned and that lens of 21st century learning as a way of getting to the standards? And what I like to point out is that's actually not the best way to think about it. Instead, I like very much the way that the Partnership for 21st Century Skills talks about this in the context of Common Core in the States. But if you just cross out Common Core and put in Swedish standards instead, this works just as well. And it says that it's important to consider these standards as the floor, not the ceiling, when you're designing your instruction, when you're thinking about what students will do. In other words, when you're looking at the standards, say, I'm not designing a SAMR ladder to get to the standards. Rather, say, I have the standards as a floor I'm going to build from. I'm going to design my units of instruction using SAMR and all the rest of these tools and models by thinking how I build from that to go beyond. So the standards act like a floor I build up from. The question I want to ask myself is, starting from these standards, where can my students get to? And that's what I want to point SAMR and all of these other things at. All right. So in just a couple of minutes, I want to go to questions. But I'm going to just very briefly, now that you've seen all of this, you've also heard from Christina as well, just want to do one more quick SAMR ladder that now you can look at with the eyes of saying, okay, we've seen all of this, so I'll go through it quickly so you can see it in action. And I decided to go with a ladder for history. So you can see all of these pieces once again coming together. Now, when we're teaching history, we don't want our students to just be memorizing dates and places and treaties and wars. We want them to be able to use history, to think about history, to create history themselves, to make decisions about their lives using historical knowledge. That means that what we want is not just memorization, but we want this type of list, such as this list, for instance. This is from Lesh, who's a teacher of history who's worked very hard on this for a couple of decades now in the States. I say, well, what do we want our students exploring? And he says, well, what we want them exploring are these core concepts, things like causality, chronology, keep on going down, empathy, change and continuity over time, intermotivation. So these are core concepts in a historical context. And he says, well, with these core concepts come these guiding criteria for how you explore these core concepts in a course. So again, can you, for instance, debate the question? This is crucial, okay? When you give students the kind of thing where everything is just a date to memorize, there's nothing to debate there. So you want to present historical questions that can be talked about, debated with multiple interpretations. You know, is it challenging? You don't want it to be the kind of question, yeah, that was easy. If it's like that, again, the students aren't learning how to use historical analysis, historical data. So what could a historical process unit of instruction designed on a Samuel ladder look like that addresses these things for something that's in the Swedish curriculum? I've read through the Swedish standards materials, and in particular I was looking at History 1A, and I noticed that History 1A has as one of its topics the Industrial Revolution, and it says not just in Sweden but throughout the world. Excellent. Let's use that as our topic that we're going to look at. At the substitution level, I'm going to tell my students, go out and forage. Forage for data. Go out and get data. You can do searches. Why? Because now we have this huge amount of information. Each student, ask them to pick a country that they're interested in. And for that country, look at all the elements you can find out there surrounding the Industrial Revolution. You can find, of course, historical documents, but you can also find things like paintings that show you how people, that's why I show you in this slide, reacted to the Industrial Revolution in that country. Popular songs, folk songs that tell you about it. Things like newspaper articles that might have been published. Things like diaries of travelers. Things like, you name it. All of these different objects that would be the raw material that you build history from, that tells you what was the experience like of the Industrial Revolution in that country that the student is interested in. Augmentation. Great, you got raw data. Have the students put that raw data in context. Have them put it in context using tools for visualization. So for instance, we have maps are ways of visualizing relations in space. We have something like Google Earth that allows the students to take all of this data, put it on a map, and do so, for instance, in layers. So you can have the student decide to turn on or off layers that contain information. This is not something you could do with a traditional map that you would just sketch on or just put pins on. Here I can immediately see. Show me the data for songs that express happiness with the features of the Industrial Revolution. Show me the ones for people who are very unhappy. Hey, look where the people who are happy lived. Look where the people who are unhappy lived. Hint, it's usually not the same place. Okay? Or timelines to express changes in time. Or I haven't shown you other possibilities here. For instance, I could have a concept map showing how different elements of this raw material is related to each other. So now the students are engaged in a sense-making activity that uses these tools with their visualization capabilities to inform their sense-making, to start saying, I wonder why this. I wonder if that. I wonder if the poor people had one perspective of this, the rich people had another, whether farmers had one perspective, and factory workers had a different one. Start to form hypotheses about what happened. Start to form hypotheses about why the Industrial Revolution happened faster or slower. Why? What was involved? Let's keep going then, because at the modification level, you can say, well, let's give them more material to inform that process. So far, you've been looking at the raw material. You've been able to use these tools to contextualize it. Now bring data into the picture. Bring analytical data. Bring the data that tells you things like how wealthy were people at on average. What was their health status? What was their educational status? How long did they live? Well, it used to be that getting all that data was a very cumbersome process, but courtesy of an app that's cross-platform, runs on pretty much anything you'd want, or can be accessed over the web in different ways, etc. It's called Gapminder, written by a fellow countryman of yours, Hans Rosling. All of this is available to students, and it's available in the context of a tool that, as I show you in this snapshot, allows them to do things like look at the chart. Say you have one student that's been focusing on Sweden, another student that's been focusing on France. And now they're wondering, why did the Industrial Revolution have different tempos in that? Well, they can be using this tool to analyze, to highlight France and Sweden, and look at different data. And see, in fact, that it did have different tempos, what consequences those different tempos had, be able to connect it back to the rest of the data they have, form more hypotheses, and now start to form something that they could integrate into making concrete historical thesis statements that they can back up with all of this. So your students aren't being told, the reason that France and Sweden had different rates of development was blah, 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 blah. They're figuring it out. They're now being historians. Of course, you're there in a role to help them out in this process. You're not just having them go blind at it, but you are acting as a guide that informs rather than somebody who says, well, here we go, I just took you there and that's it. There's nothing else for you to do. You're a guide that's there by the side of your students and saying, okay, that's a good theory, let's push it a little further. Talk with your classmates, share this with your classmates, and back it up with all of these materials that you have here. So your students have come to the end of the road. They've come up with this theory. Is that it? Let's wrap it up, and let's wrap it up in an interesting direction. They've come up with all of this, whatever thesis they've come, and you and fellow classmates have worked with them to refine it into a tenable, sustainable historical thesis. Have them, using digital storytelling tools, tell the story of their thesis, but let's give them a different, authentic audience this time. Let's say that because this topic shows up in other units of instruction as well, in the earlier grades, in different ways, let's have them package what they found out into digital storytelling materials that they can share with their younger counterparts. In other words, have them become teachers to their fellow students. Once again, I'll cite them one last time. William and Black have shown that this is yet again a valuable, powerful way for students to learn, for students to understand more about the subject they're learning, but also about how they and other people learn. So this is the end of the road, okay, for this particular project. We have had our students being historians, and being historians that don't just keep their findings to themselves, but develop them into effective, sustainable theses, and theses that ultimately are used to teach others. All right, so I want to show you that last exemplar in the context of what you already thought about. There are going to be many, many other exemplars on my website for you to download, so let me put up the slide. There you go, so you know where to get this. That's my website. Here, you'll be able, in a couple of days, to download the slides. They're not up there yet, because what happens is at each stop, I've used different exemplars, etc., so I keep adding to the set. So with the complete set in a few days, you'll be able to download it, get everything I've shown you, and much, much more. When I do so, if you follow me on Twitter, I'll tweet, and you'll be able to find out that it's out there. I haven't been tweeting a lot lately, because things have been pretty busy. But I promise to get better at that, so hopefully I'll have some other interesting things to share with you. And finally, if you'd like to get in touch with me via email, that's my email address. So I'll leave this up here, but I'd like to take the time now that we have for a few questions.
Yes.
So.
First of all, I think we should invite the audience if there is any question that you want to address. Det är någon som vill ställa en fråga eller har en tanke och dela med Ruben. Vi har till och med en mikrofon till det här, så att göra er hörda ordentligt. Well, let me start then with one of the questions that we had earlier this week. It was about e-books.
Yes.
You know, this possibility now to carry around 250 books in your school bag. Is that the only positive thing with e-books? Or what would you say, Ruben, very shortly, I think, because we're very short of time?
Yeah, very briefly. E-books, no, the potential is much greater than just 250 books in your bag. Mind you, 250 books in your bag is not something to sneer at.
Well,
because it allows...
You're right.
Very not. Because it allows a certain range of exploration, you know, just like I did in that exemplar with allowing students to find things that they are interested, perhaps in a range of materials, where before they would only have had one source. But there's much more you can do. If you look at modern ebook authoring tools, and you know, the most advanced probably these days is iBooks Author, but I'm sure we'll see many more, you can start incorporating other things in there. So you can start incorporating media, movies, etc. Okay, that starts to push up from substitution, particularly if you add some type of interactivity in there into the augmentation domain. So maybe you, instead of having a static map, you can have a map that you explore by layers, like I was explaining. But you can go even further than that. You can add things like little applets, little programs that allow students to run simulations, run visualizations on the material in the book, and have that in the context of the text, which pushes you up into the modification domain. And finally, if you want to go even further than that, you can say, you know, you can always include in an ebook reader, this is up to the author, you can include a link that says, take all that data, maybe including some of the one generated by the visualization, package it up, and by clicking on this link, boom, launch an application outside the ebook that takes all of that and allows the student to continue working with it in a social domain, in the domain of other applications, and so on. So in fact, the potential is huge for ebooks. We've barely scratched the surface thus far, and I think we're going to see much more in coming years.
Interesting, especially for those who are focusing a little bit extra on that. I guess there are some here, maybe. Any questions now? Någon som har laddat någonting nu, medan ni har lyssnat till sista? Det är inte många gånger man har chansen att ställa frågor till världens främsta antilandforskare. Försiktiga här. Ja. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I have millions of questions to Ruben, and yet I've spent the entire week together with you, and we're discussing a lot of different subjects, of course. But one question that keeps coming back to us during this week is, if you're a teacher and you're puzzled with all these possibilities that this new situation, or well, it's not that new, but it's still a very a situation that can develop a lot for you as a teacher. Where would I start with all these possibilities as a teacher? What do you say, Ruben?
That's a very good question. My recommendation when that question or that type of question comes up is to say, look, I realize it's a huge universe of possibilities out there. But there are three particular directions that when people are looking for a place to start, if they don't know where to start yet, I say, well, look at one of these three. This may be the key to starting that you're looking for. The first direction I recommend that people look at is answering the question, what made you passionate about the subject you teach? What made you say, I really want to study history. I'm fascinated about math. Well, pick that aspect within the context of the course unit you're looking at. Pick one key element that best represents where that passion comes from and use that as the focus of your development. That's one that I find works very well. A second possibility is kind of the converse. It's the one that answers the question that says, oh, you know what? Every year, I have a group of students that get stuck on this part of the course. Every year, the students get to this point and don't go any further. They don't understand this. Oh, every year. That's the negative version. It's the, okay, hold on. If that's the point, then use that as your focus. Choose that key element. Identify the key point that some students are finding impossible to get by, where they're stopping and losing their place in the course, and use that as the focus of your development. Say, that's where I'm going to focus this summer ladder I'm going to develop. The third one is neither perhaps of these, although I could coincide with one of them, which is to say, well, okay, I've got my course, and there's many, many topics that will come up in it. many sub-elements of this unit of instruction. But if I had to pick one that I think will be particularly valuable to the students in other courses, in other things they might attempt, what would it be? So say it's a course in math, for instance. I say, I have all of these topics. Which one will be most useful to them in later uses of math, in physics, in other sciences, in history, in their lives, and making decisions? Which one would I pick? Okay, identify one of those. Obviously, sometimes there can be many, but pick one of them and use that as your central focus. And I find that that also works very well. So one of these three, your passion, the stopping point, the bigger influence type questions, I find one of those three can frequently be an excellent point to start when you don't quite know where to start. And one more thing. Regardless of what you pick as your starting point, as you're doing this, as you're going through this, talk. Talk a lot. Talk with your fellow teachers. Have groups with them. Discuss this. Bring students into the mix while you're at it. Bring administrators into the mix if you can. Have these discussions. Say, I like that. I don't like that idea. I'm trying to do this. What do you think? Oh, I don't know. Let's go and find out together. Talk. Discuss this. You know, because for some people, the lone wolf, I'll go it alone approach works fine. And I certainly don't want to take that away from them. So if that works for you, hey, all the more power. But for most of us, to be honest with you, we work best, we do better when we share, when we discuss, when we talk. So I want to encourage you to do that. It makes it more interesting, easier to do, and also it sets the stage for even broader opening of the doors. Because I also want to encourage you to use these social media to talk and engage a broader community. Whatever you prefer, whether it's blogs, wikis, Facebook, or Twitter, you know, for instance, Twitter. Even when, as now, I'm too busy to post tweets, I still follow people on Twitter, and I find that every day I learn from those people I follow. Every day itself, that's fascinating. That's a great piece of information. That's a great idea. That's something I can use in my work. So again, engage your immediate community and engage the larger community. That's what I would recommend as well.
That sounds reasonable to me, very reasonable. Not doing all at the same time, focusing, you know, set focus. I think we're done for today.
Yes,
here.
we are.
I think so.
I'm just going to say a few finishing words, but it seems we have a question.
Oh, we have a question. Sorry.
I'm not sure if it's easy to answer. You have talked a lot about technology, and it's not only about the technology, but what we do with it. But it seems to be like sort of in a crossroad right now, where some schools are investing in laptops and some are investing in tablets. Mm-hmm. Do you think that either one of them has a greater potential, or are they essentially equal?
Very good question. I think it's a question of what you're going to do with them. The tablets are more mobile. They're easier to use in a variety of settings. The laptops are more powerful. You have a broader range of software available for them right now, and you can do some things that are more difficult to do than on the tablets. At the end of the day, I'll have to be honest with you. I think you can't go wrong with each one. In other words, if you make a good informed decision, I think you can do an excellent program with laptops, and I think you can do an excellent program with tablets. Either one is very powerful, but you have to be thinking about the whole ensemble of what it is you're doing. I've worked with programs that use either one across a very broad spectrum of ages. So I certainly can't tell you that at this stage, oh, you must go with one versus the other. I think they're both amazing tools. The key thing is to get them into your hands, into the hands of the students, and put them to work in the fashion that we've described.
Någon mer fråga?
All right, it seems to be about lunchtime, I reckon. So if you just give me a minute or two. All right, today so far we have been provided with several models and tools that we can use in our work as teachers. From you, Ruben, and from you, Christina, we have also been been taught about some models and about focus.
Yeah.
And I would say that technology is empowering or enabling us with numerous possibilities. And it's now up to us to utilize these models and these tools and the technology that we have in our classrooms, or that we soon will have in our classrooms. So utilize these things together. And if you do that, and with the accumulated competence and ability in this room, I know that we can do great things. So, without any further ado, I'd like to thank Ruben for today's seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And albeit a small gift, sometimes big things come in small packages.
Thank you. That's very
And
kind.
being somewhat of a gentleman, I think the lady deserves a slightly bigger gift.
Oh, thank you. Tack så mycket.